Okay, so Star Wars is made. It's out. It's a big hit. Where do we go from here? I'm going to talk today a little bit about the sequels within the original trilogy and how they differ from what the original plan was. So, first, let me read a number of quotes. Most of these I found in A Secret History of Star Wars, but these quotes are, they were just cribbed during the research for that book from various sources, interviews in the press, and stuff like that. And I think it's really kind of interesting how it works. Let's first talk about some notes that were written for Alan Dean Foster, who wrote the novelization of Star Wars. And this was before the movie came out. This was in December 1975. And this is from, this was him talking about what he thought the books would be, the sequel to Star Wars would be. And so I'm going to read this. This is a direct quote from George Lucas. It says, "I want to have Luke kiss the princess in the second book. The second book will be Gone with the Wind in outer space. She likes Luke, but Han is Clark Gable. Well, she may appear to get Luke because in the end I want Han to leave. Han splits at the end of the second book and we learn who Darth Vader is. In the third book, I want the story to be just the soap opera of the Skywalker family, which ends with the destruction of the Empire. Then someday I want to do the backstory of Kenobi as a young man, a story of the Jedi and how the Emperor eventually takes over and turns the whole thing from a republic into an empire and tricks all the Jedi and kills them. The whole battle where Luke's father gets killed. That would be impossible to do, but it's great to dream about." So there's an awful lot to unpack here. First off, it's obvious that Luke and Leia were not supposed to be brothers and sister at this point. And this was, again, after the script for Star Wars was more or less finalized and they were kind of about to start actual filming of it. Luke and Leia were not brother and sister. They were clearly romantic interests. It's also interesting to note that Darth Vader is clearly not Luke's father because he's still talking about Luke's father being killed by Darth Vader. So there's another interesting one. Here's a few more quotes. Here's from Lucas in 1977 after the movie had already come out. It's again a direct quote. "It was one of the original ideas of doing a sequel that if I put enough people in it and it was designed carefully enough, I could make a sequel about anything. Or if any of the actors gave me a lot of trouble or didn't want to do it or didn't want to be in the sequel, I could always make a sequel without one." Gary Kurtz added, and he was the producer on Star Wars, and he said this also in 1977, "We've had a lot of speculation about the sequels to Star Wars, and we're working on story material that will develop into potentially one or more motion pictures that will use the same characters. I like to consider them different adventures rather than direct sequels." Mark Hamill, obviously the actor for Luke, in 1978, They always wanted to set up their own little James Bond series, taking the environment George has set up but keeping it limitless in terms of what the characters can do. For the sequel, he's going to add new characters. It won't be a direct sequel to the first story. It'll be a series of adventures, in the galaxy. If Star Wars runs as long as I think they're going to run, I'll be Ben Kenobi's age when I do the last one. Alan Arnold, who was a journalist in 1978, said Gary Kurtz described Star Wars as a new chapter in the Star Wars saga because the intention is never to refer to it as a sequel for the simple reason that George Lucas stories do not have a chronological sequence. Lucas again in 1977, another direct quote, "I think the sequels will be much better. What I want to do is direct the last sequel. I could do the first one and the last one and let everyone else do the ones in between. I would try to get some good directors and see what their interpretation of the theme is. I think it will be interesting. It's like taking a theme in film school. Say, okay, everybody do their interpretation of this theme. It's an interesting idea to see how people interpret the genre." It's a fun genre to play with. I put up the concrete slab of the walls, and now everybody can have fun drawing the pictures and putting up the little gargoyles and doing all the really fun stuff. And it's a competition. I'm hoping if I get friends of mine, they'll want to do a much better film. Like, I'll show George that I could do a film twice that good, and I think they can. And then I want to do the last one so I can do one twice as good as everybody else. Time magazine in 1988, here's a direct quote, Lucas has set up 4 corporations. Star Wars Corp will make Star Wars 2 and then count them 10 other planned sequels. Later in the same article, it reports that Lucas was planning on 23 years of constant filming with 2001 as a projected finish date. Again, this is 1978. But with no real concepts or stories in mind beyond some generic speculation. Notably, 12 was the number of episodes, which is what they talk about here, that the Republic serials had. This 12-episode plan was officially announced in the Star Wars fanzine Bantha Tracks. As the author of Secret History of Star Wars, and this is a quote from him, unlike the contemporary view of Star Wars, the series was not planned as an elaborate, self-contained story divided into 6 chapters. It was to be in the vein of adventure theater, with different Adventure of the Week type films, and even the time periods of the films could differ and be presented in a non-linear fashion. There's a lot of other stuff that's kind of interesting that you can see how it developed. You can see many of the early drafts of the script of Star Wars and of Empire Strikes Back, for that matter. They're available online and they're not terribly hard to find. It's interesting that the Sith were originally a band of Force-using mercenaries or pirates that were recruited by the Emperor, who was kind of supposed to be a corrupt politician, not a Dark Lord and a sorcerer. He was supposed to be a corrupt politician who had recruited these guys to counter the Jedi, and that's kind of where they came from. I think even after Star Wars was over, there was never the intention that Darth Vader was, the only Sith, although it kind of came to be that he was the only one that showed up. But this, of course, eventually evolved into the rule of 2, where there was the Dark Master, who was the Emperor, and his apprentice, who is kind of, the enforcer or whatever. But this is not the original intention. It was supposed to be, like I said, a band of pirates. The Force actually kind of grew in prominence significantly. The early drafts of the script, the Jedi didn't have the Force at all. They were basically just samurai in space. Of course, the earliest drafts of Star Wars more closely resembled the Hidden Fortress. What else changed? As obviously I mentioned the fact that Darth Vader wasn't originally supposed to be Luke's father, and Leia wasn't originally supposed to be Luke's sister, and it was supposed to be, it was very clear that Luke and Leia were romantic interest, and that development where that, didn't work out started in Empire Strikes Back, where Han kind of became the obvious romantic interest, and then the nail was put into the coffin in number 3 when they said, oh, hey, you're actually brother and sister. So there was an awful lot of change in Star Wars, and it's interesting to see how this changed. There's other things that Empire did too, in many ways not necessarily for the better, and you could say that this vision of Star Wars was better or worse than what we got. I guess that's a matter of opinion. I think there are some things that are other changes that Empire brought that were kind of less a matter of opinion. They were actual kind of complications and had introduced problems to the series, which didn't really metastasize until much later, but their roots kind of go back to all the way to Empire Strikes Back. One interesting note is that as Lucas was working with Lee Brackett on the earlier drafts of Empire Strikes Back, they still hadn't changed Star Wars to Episode 4, A New Hope. It was, The Empire Strikes Back was Chapter 2, The Empire Strikes Back. And the actual, meta title was The Adventures of Luke Skywalker. Chapter 1 was Star Wars. Chapter 2 was The Empire Strikes Back. So that was kind of a change. It's also interesting that they had gotten rid of the idea that they talked about immediately after Star Wars of having, non-chronological, non-sequel. Empire Strikes Back is very clearly and obviously a sequel to Star Wars. It wasn't until the third draft that they came up with the idea of Darth Vader being Luke's father. In fact, Luke's father makes a clear appearance in the early drafts as a Force ghost, and Luke, it kind of takes the Jedi oath. Again, the Jedi were a little bit more like a knightly order at this point. Luke takes the Jedi oath from his father, who appears to him as a Force ghost in early drafts of this. So there's a lot of changes here. Let me read again from The Secret History. This is just a brief quote. With this change in character and story, the Star Wars series would irrevocably shift from the Flash Gordon-type serial style to a more epic Dune-type saga, from a storybook-like tale of good versus evil to a complicated chronicle of temptation and redemption. Once Lucas brought Father Skywalker back into the series, he and Obi-Wan became redundant, as Obi-Wan was essentially a copy of him, a noble, elderly Jedi who is a father figure to Luke and is betrayed by Vader. And suddenly, Dagobah is full of old, noble Jedi ghosts who are basically the same character. To make matters worse, Yoda was created to replace Obi-Wan. He was even based off an early version of him. So really, he too is born out of the Father Skywalker in a way. Father Skywalker is killed off and then turns into Obi-Wan. Obi-Wan is killed off and turns into Yoda. You can see Lucas writing himself into corners and having to invent new story directions. But once the characters were all brought together, the story did not work dramatically. Perhaps the idea of a Jedi Trinity worked better in concept, but once actually implemented in script form, it revealed itself to not be the success Lucas envisioned. That's the end of the quote. But let me point out something else here. There's other issues. This also changed the nature of Obi-Wan and the Jedi. No longer could they be seen as paragons of goodness from a more civilized age. If Obi-Wan and Yoda would outright lie to Luke about his own father, what other shady behavior would they be up to? If Yoda could tell Luke to sacrifice his friends, how else could he fall from the noble and heroic? So I think this was the moment, which was the actual death of Star Wars as it was, and the rebirth of Star Wars into something else that it is now. That wasn't always a good thing, because although it was a suitably dramatic moment to say, no, I am your father, and a huge bit of suspense that endured for literally 3 years in the minds of audiences, it also made the Jedi morally ambiguous. It made the whole saga more mythic and less adventurous. It bordered on ponderous many times because of this development specifically, and those problems kind of plagued subsequent entries in the series significantly. That's kind of what I think about the sequels. The Empire Strikes Back, although for many, many years it was my favorite movie of all time, it's still, I think, one of my favorite movies. I have to admit that it's got the seeds of the fall of Star Wars in it. The fact that the Jedi were no longer really paragons of wisdom and virtue, but Lucas still kind of tried to pretend like they were, even as they were lying to Luke, as they were telling him things that were outright false to deceive him, as they were telling him that his friends didn't matter, that he shouldn't be heroic, he needs to stay and finish his training. And this is all supposed to be reasonable wisdom, although it defies kind of what the nature of heroism, which is so important to the swashbuckling vibe of good space opera. So, Luke ignored their advice. He went and did it anyway, but, we're supposed to believe that he fails because of this. That if he had listened, things would have been different. I think that this is, again, part of the fall of Star Wars. Another thing that happened to Luke over time, and I mentioned this a little bit last time, is that it became a much more bland character, removing or making him too serious and removing any hint of any romantic interest between him and Leia, made him into this kind of weird monk type character who was supposed to be super serious all the time. Yoda, in many ways, was a bad character because he turned the Jedi into something that took themselves really seriously, even though their so-called wisdom was, basically reading fortune cookies. It's nothing. There's no there, as the saying goes. And the Jedi code and the Jedi wisdom is singularly unimpressive as we learn more about it. And Jedi behavior, as we learn more about Yoda and Obi-Wan, is also singularly unimpressive. They're really not admirable anymore. And it becomes very odd in Return of the Jedi. And although I was young enough when it came out that I don't know that I was about 9 or 10 or something like, well, I was 10 or 11, I guess. Whatever. I was in 5th grade, I think, or 6th grade when Return of the Jedi came out. I was young enough that I didn't really grasp what this meant, but at the same time, I kind of just thought it was very odd that at the end, he throws away his lightsaber, refuses to fight, and somehow we're supposed to believe that this is winning. Yeah, you win by not fighting. You win by letting evil do whatever it wants. And, it worked out by Deus Ex Machina, because then Vader has this instant deathbed conversion and kills the Emperor and tries to repent in the last few seconds of his life, which apparently works, because then his Force Ghost shows up on, Endor a few minutes later. Even as a kid, and I wasn't really thinking very hard about it, that struck me as just not right. It's like, that's not heroism. That's not good and evil. That's nonsense. And of course, now that I'm older, it is much more explicitly and specifically nonsense. I dislike that tremendously. I dislike tremendously the whole vibe of, the dark side of the Force kind of literally controlling you, where Darth Vader kind of's like, oh yeah, I'd like to do this, but I can't because, the dark side, what are you going to do? That struck me as very bizarre, and I like it much less now that I'm older. And there's a few other things too. Now, that said though, these structural problems didn't really metastasize until after the original trilogy was long over. So I'm not going to go too much into them until we talk about the prequels and the sequels and other material, which will be part of another video, because I've already gone longer on this one than I would have liked. Let me just say, though, that I find the original vision of what Star Wars was going to be more compelling than what we actually got. Although I think The Empire Strikes Back in many ways was in some ways it was a better made film, and I really enjoy The Empire Strikes Back, of course. I also have to admit that I think it also laid the foundations for future problems in the series, and I kind of wish that they hadn't done that. Anyway, we'll end it here, and we'll talk more about the prequels and some of the other stuff that came out during the Lucasfilm era, the pre-Disney era. We'll talk about the prequels and some of the EU